Welcome to the second half of our conference this afternoon. We're going to be talking about what the future of energy is. Now, it's hard to, that's not a small topic, and we are very lucky to be joined by three extremely distinguished guests who will discuss this topic. To my immediate left is Adele Morris. She's the Policy Director for Climate and Energy Economics at Brookings. So we're very pleased to have you. Left to her is David Kreutzer, a research fellow on energy and economics, climate change at Heritage. Thank you for coming. And on the far end over here is Vice Admiral McGinn. He's the president and CEO of the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACOR. We frankly are privileged to have these folks to listen to today, and I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation. All right, so the first question I'll hand off to Adele, since you're sitting next to me. Can the future of energy be known?
Well, thank you so much, Nick, and it's a privilege to be here, and I want to thank the Chamber Foundation, and our sponsors, Calvert and Future 500, for this invitation. I really appreciate that. Well, I think we can't know the future exactly, but we can express our vision of what we think would be workable. And would this be a good time to talk about
Sure.
my vision? Okay, so this is my little I Have a Dream speech. My colleague Michael Greenstone, who runs our Hamilton project at Brookings, was putting together a big sort of fiscal policy palooza, and he came to me and he asked me to do a proposal on climate policy and pricing carbon. And up to now, I've sort of just been an analyst and examined different policies and the economics associated with them, and so this kind of pinned me to the wall, and so I wanted to illustrate what I thought could be a deal on climate policy and carbon pricing. And I wanted to just start from a few premises. And the first is the premise that really the biggest challenge going forward for energy is the unaddressed market failure of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really one of the underlying concerns about energy. I'm also going to start with the premise that prices matter. We've heard that already. And that the default regulation is not no regulation, but it's the Clean Air Act regulation of greenhouse gases. That's the existing statutory authority. And my premise is that that's both expensive and ineffective, or at least it won't be effective for a long time because of the process it would take to really use that authority. So just to give you the highlights of my proposal, and it's available in this volume put together. I put some copies in the back. It's Chapter 11 of our big fiscal volume. So this is sort of an illustration of the deal I think that could allow many parties to claim a victory. The idea would be to start with a price on carbon of $16 a ton of CO2, a very simple upstream excise tax on the carbon content of fossil fuels and other identifiable greenhouse gas point sources, and ramp that up gradually over time at 4% over inflation, so that price expectations work almost as importantly as current prices. And at the same time, we'd suspend Clean Air Act authority over greenhouse gases as we let these price signals take effect. And at the same time, we'd get rid of $6 billion in tax expenditures and direct spending on clean energy deployment, because you'd have a price on the fossil competitors. And where possible, we'd repeal other energy-related regulations that could be made redundant with a price on carbon. We'd have a vigorous diplomatic initiative that would leverage U.S. action into action by other countries, which we know is critical to actual success on the climate challenge. And we would use the revenue in the most pro-growth way possible. So I would sort of earmark about 15% of the revenue to hold the poorest households harmless. We don't want to make the poor any poorer. And in the first decade, the preponderance of the revenue would go towards corporate income tax reform, reducing the marginal statutory rate from 35% to 28%. This is the most distortionary tax. It's the most anti-competitive tax, and reforming it would be one of the most pro-growth tax reforms available. And any remaining revenue would be used for deficit reduction, which I like to call a reduction in future tax burdens. There'd be no offsets and no earmarking for any purposes other than for protection of the poor, and no diminution of research spending. So the research component is important. Now, why did I do this? I wanted to do the most, like I said, pro-growth tax reform while having that effective price signal that makes it feasible to reduce other regulatory burdens, so you get a more pro-free enterprise energy system overall. And it really would reduce emissions. We calculate about 9.3 billion tons of emissions reductions over 20 years, or about $148 billion in climate benefits if you value the social cost of carbon at about $16 a ton. Obviously, that's just one estimate of that value. And then starting with that modest price signal would mean that energy prices in the short run would have only modest effects. And so each side could say, look, we've tackled climate, we've had pro-growth tax reform, we've had regulatory reform, and we've had an approach that holds the poor harmless. And that's the idea. So I'd be happy to take comments on that or talk about other issues in the energy sector, but I throw that out there as to just get the ball rolling of an illustrative deal that might actually work.
Thank you, Adele. David, do you have an I have a dream speech also?
No, I'm sorry. One of the great things about being a free market economist is you don't have to have the plan. You just have to want to lay out the groundwork where somebody else can come up with a plan, which we've been doing very well for a couple of centuries anyway. And I will say Adele's my favorite economist that I debate on the other side. I think she's very sharp, but she definitely did lay out a dream, and it would only be slightly less realistic if she included some money for eliminating childhood diseases. I just don't think you're going to get I mean, I'd almost want to work for the Center for American Progress if this gets proposed, because it'd be so easy to demagogue. You could say, you're going to raise grandma's heating bill so that we can cut the corporate income tax. You know, that's not going to happen. I don't think. Now, maybe there's some other modification she can make her dream work out. But what I would like to see, my dream is that we unleash North American energy independence. Obviously, I'm not talking about, you know, eliminating all of the environmental regulations that we already have. The states are doing a pretty good job, I think, of controlling the fracking, which seems to be the cause du jour. And if we do, it's going to make affordable energy available for more people, and we can have more economic growth. What we don't know, this is what I think is the hubris of our generation, is that we see ourselves at the pinnacle of human evolution, and it's not going to keep going. All right? Our ancestors weren't quite as clever as we are. They did all sorts of horrible things. We are omniscient. Our descendants will be forever infantile, and we have to make sure the world is okay for them. They're going to be clever people following us. There are going to be other issues. What we don't know is really what's going to be the most pressing issue 100 years from now. I don't think it's going to be climate. All right? What I do believe very strongly is that whatever pressing issue is upon us, we're going to best be able to handle it the stronger our economy is. And we don't get a stronger economy through higher energy prices and restricted access to energy.
Okay. Well, we will revisit this. Admiral McGinn?
We face three significant challenges. I'll talk about the United States, but effectively globally, these challenges apply. One is energy security, having the energy we need to continue to grow our economy, to sustain and improve quality of life, especially in the developing world. To be able to do it, have that energy affordable, and to have it resilient to natural disasters or some of the mischief that we cause ourselves. The second challenge is economic security. We want to be able to have positive trajectory for economic growth and creation of jobs that are quality and sustainable. Is environmental security. Certainly a lot of the attention gets paid to the threat of global warming and that type of climate change, and it is a very, very significant challenge. But it's also an aspect of environmental security that is at the regional and local levels that is more meaningful to us, and we can see it, we can sense it. It's visceral in many senses. So my contention is that clean renewable energy, and I include energy efficiency in that phrase, gives us a triple bottom line win. We get better energy security because we create a more diverse energy portfolio, a balanced portfolio, just like you would want to in an investment portfolio, financial investment portfolio. Balance, diversity, resiliency to the dynamics that are unknown perhaps in the future. But when you've got some choices, you're more resilient. It is more secure because it is not just a single point failure. And I want to emphasize that the energy I'm talking about writ large is certainly electricity, but also transportation energy. In this case, primarily we rely on petroleum products for transportation energy, but it's slowly evolving to include natural gas and electric vehicles, and eventually, in some very unique cases now, even hydrogen-powered vehicles. The aspect of economic security. If you take a look at the creation of a new industry and all of the value chains that are created in a new industry, like clean energy, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. When you make investments in it, whether it's private sector, public-private partnership, or whatever, the return in terms of economic growth and job creation is significantly greater than if you try to applicate more investment on existing and mature industries, like the fossil fuel industry for the most part. And the third aspect of this environmental security is just so clear. Adele talked about the fact that we really need to consider prices. Prices do matter, but in many cases, in far too many cases, the prices that we pay for energy, whether it's gasoline for our cars and trucks, or whether it's the electric bill to the utility, don't take into consideration the totally, fully accounted costs of that energy in its delivered form, and then the way it is used and the after effects of having used a particular form of energy. I'm talking here about what Adele and her colleague economists would call externalities. They are real. We are paying these costs, but in far too many cases, we don't have a free market, as David pointed out. We have a very, very unique aspect related to virtually every aspect of energy that is quite unfree market, because it does not really take into consideration the fully accounted costs of the generation, distribution, and use of energy. To illustrate this, I'll use audience participation. How many people here like electricity? How many love it? It's great. You know, it's bad enough when you wake up in the morning and your iPhone doesn't work, or your iPad, you're really upset, the internet's down, or whatever, my internet service provider failed me. But when you get up and Pepco has failed you, wow, that's a real problem. We love it. We love it because it's our quality of life, our economic growth, etc. Okay, we've established we love electricity. How many people who love electricity would not mind living 5 miles downwind from a coal-fired power plant with your families? I see your Peabody stock investment must be doing well, David.
I have lived downwind from
Cheap shot.
Well, The interesting thing about not so many hands going up in answer to that question is that we all know, and some can actually measure, and it has been measured, that we do pay a price or we incur a cost for many of the forms of energy that we use. In this case, I used one of the most significant coal-fired electricity to illustrate the point that those personal, family, community costs manifested in health care, loss of productivity, et cetera, or in Tennessee, a coal silt river flowing into neighborhoods. All of these are real costs, but they are not reflected in the price that we pay. They're reflected in the price of insurance, the taxes that we pay locally and statewide and federal. So my point is, I am not advocating, my dream speech is not we need to get all on clean energy overnight. That would be a big mistake. It would be bad for our economy. It would be bad for our stability, our security, our quality of life. But we need to start moving very deliberately and fairly quickly to start broadening the diversity and balancing that portfolio of energy for both transportation and for electricity, because there are tremendous benefits to be gained by doing it. And we need to do it in a smooth way. We don't need to assume that the way we've always done it for hundreds of years or 100+ years in case of electricity and more than that in case of use of petroleum are going to be there forever, because we can start getting the benefits right now. In fact, we already have started in the case of renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral McGinn. All right, David, so I'd like to talk about externalities, since it's been brought up.
Me too.
Yeah, okay.
Let's go.
All right, would you agree that externalities are a problem, that they're not internalized, or can be a problem? And let's take coal as an example. The soot goes into the air, affects people's lungs, affects quality of life, cost of health care goes up, and so on. How do we deal with this?
You know, I go to all these panels, and everybody says that, well, they clearly went to the first half of the econ lecture on externalities, a course that I used to teach. They didn't hang around for the second part where they said, well, you know, there are a variety of ways in which you can control this externality. The economists are partial to a tax on the good that produces the externality. There are, however, other ways, maybe less efficient, and that is you require technology, or you put caps on the emissions of certain products. Of soot, for instance, or SO2 or NOx. Guess what? We already have regulations on all of those pollutants producing electricity in the United States, and the corporations that produce the electricity pay billions of dollars for those control technologies. Those prices are passed on to consumers. They are reflected in the price. As a matter of fact, it's quite conceivable that we're over-controlling for some of those goods, because of the political science of it, and how if you structure it right, the utilities can actually make more money with a sort of cap-and-trade scheme, which we have for NOx and SOx, than some other ways. So the fact that there is an externality does not mean that we have too much of that. And I think all the economists will tell you placing a tax on it is not going to get rid of all the pollution. It's going to reduce it. And I think Adele would tell you there's an optimal amount of pollution. It's not clear that we're above or below that for the pollutants that the Admiral is talking about. The other thing, the supposed externality of energy security, we need to be absolutely crystal clear. We do not have anything approaching any sort of security problem with electricity. We can produce twice, 3 times, 10 times as much electricity as we're producing now for centuries without having to worry about running out of the material. We have, we can talk about nuclear, we can talk about natural gas, we could go a century down the road, we might have gas hydrates, all sorts, we have plenty of coal. That's not a problem now, it's not a problem in 10 years, not a problem in 20 years, not a problem in a century. It's security for electricity. So let's not conflate windmills and solar panels with energy security. Have nothing to do with it whatsoever. If you want to talk about energy security in the liquid fuels, okay, maybe we have something, in which case I would say, why not produce more?
If I could just interject and respond quickly. You know, back in October, early part of November, if we had asked the citizens of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey how they felt about their energy security, electricity-wise or fuel-wise, they'd give you a very strong answer that quite insecure. So energy security isn't just in the traditional military security, national security sense. It is it going to be available? Is it going to be affordable? Is it going to be resilient to factors that we can expect, not precisely when, but know that there are going to be some shall we say, stressors on our ability to generate electricity or fuel or what have you.
All right, Adele. So I want you to visit externalities. Specifically, do you see carbon emissions as an externality?
Absolutely. I mean, when I put gasoline in my car, the price I pay reflects the cost to explore, produce, market, transport that fuel, but it absolutely does not include the cost associated with the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so the reason economists get preoccupied by internalizing externalities is it's by far the most cost-effective way to address those emissions, because we've established here that markets matter, and there's nothing like unleashing market forces to induce investment and capital stock turnover and innovation and efficiency around exactly the thing you're worried about. I mean, what's the alternative? The alternative is to tell everybody what technology they have to adopt and tell them what kind of light bulbs they have to buy and get into the nitty-gritty details or subsidize electric sports cars. Is that really what we want to do? Is that how we want to influence outcomes? Or do we want to let the market work towards the objective that price signals will evolve? And I just want to respond to one thing that David said. I mean, that's what would I tell Grandma? And what I would tell Grandma, first of all, is that, first of all, Grandma cares about future generations, and any grandma you talk to will go on about her grandkids. So I do think that everybody has an interest in future generations. And I would also tell Grandma, grandmas who live on capital income, as most retired folks do, will have an interest in efficient tax structures and in a reform of the corporate income tax. Firms don't have welfare, people have welfare, and they might have welfare as shareholders as much as they do as consumers. So that matters. And I would also say, what are the other ways you can balance the budget deficit? You can do it through entitlement reform. And who's going to be hit the hardest? It's going to be folks on Social Security and Medicare. And, pick your poison. Are you going to do it through taxing pollution, or are you going to do it through affecting the incomes of folks in their golden years? And finally, I would just say that the alternative would be reducing entitlement spending or taxing more productive economic activity, and at the same time having inefficient and costly control of greenhouse gases. I mean, that's because that's the default. We're not comparing a carbon tax to no climate policy. We're comparing it to costly and less effective policy. And so, I really do think Grandma's going to care about all of those things.
All right. Let's shift to, and let's talk about security specifically, energy security. Now, we have established, well, we haven't established actually, whether or not we're secure or not. But as far as shipping oil is concerned, the cost of protecting the sea lanes around the world, this seems to me to be a significant externality and an incredibly costly one that is often, it's almost a subsidy to oil. David, I'd like your thoughts on that.
Okay. Now, I don't know whether we should be protecting the sea lanes for Saudi Arabia or not. Okay. So the question is, who would fill the void? All right. Would it be China? Would it be Saudi Arabia? Would it be Iran? Would we want one of those countries to be protecting the sea lanes? Then the next question is, okay, how much less do we care if we're importing 3 million barrels a day or 2 million barrels a day or no million barrels a day? Do we not care about the shipping lanes around the world? I think we do. So I think this is a false choice to say, well, if we have some more windmills and if we have some more biofuels, we can just get rid of the Seventh Fleet. That's not going to happen. Now, whether we should have it there or not is one question. Now, the second question, which I think is relevant to this discussion, is if we reduce our imports of oil, how much does that change our concern about Iran? I don't think it changes it at all. Well, not enough to make much difference. We imported zero from the Soviet Union all through the Cold War. We spent billions and billions and billions defending ourselves from the potential that they had. So I think it's the thought of a crazy person with nuclear weapons that explains a lot of what's going on in the Persian Gulf, as much as protecting the tankers that are flowing through there.
All right, it's teed up.
I shouldn't. Yeah, if I win this one, I would deserve a couple of gold stars.
I think David makes a couple of important points, and one is that there are reasons for having the Seventh Fleet or the Sixth Fleet or the Fifth Fleet or whatever that go beyond energy security. However, first time we put an aircraft carrier battle group inside the Strait of Hormuz was in 1989. It had been more than 40 years since an aircraft carrier had been there. Why? Saddam Hussein rattling sabers up in the northern Gulf and in Iraq. And we have continued that presence in the North Arabian Sea and inside the Gulf for many, many years. It is part of the external costs. They're there for other reasons, and if we suddenly completely divorced ourselves from the economic realities of a global fungible commodity called oil, with prices set by the global economy, we conceivably could take some of those costs out of our men and women in uniform, which we all acknowledge we pay a price not just in treasure but in blood as well. The other point is that I'd say 5 years ago, if we were having this conversation, I'd probably be much stronger on energy security and the fact that our economy can come grinding to a halt because we import 60% of our oil, et cetera. Because of the technology getting at tight oil, the substitution of oil by natural gas and other things, and to some extent renewables, a small extent, we are finding ourselves with the blessing of less dependence on oil. But the problem is it hasn't helped our balance of payments in a way that it needs to. And because it is, so let's say we import 40% or 30% or 20%, what is going to happen if, in fact, the Iranians decided that we're tired of these sanctions, or you attacked our nuclear facilities, we're going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz? 20% of the world's oil supply that comes through the Strait of Hormuz from the Arabian Gulf would be cut off. That would not directly affect us in a physical sense, but in an economic sense, it would be devastating. You would watch the price of a barrel of oil from the low 90s right now rapidly shoot up, probably in a couple of trading days time frame, up to above $150 a barrel. And it would stay there for a long time because these things have a lot of inertia coming down, not going up. And the problem with that is that it would reverberate throughout our economy. Everything that is delivered as a result of some use of transportation or farming or whatever, manufacturing, that relied on oil in this global market would be affected. That would be devastating. And I've seen a lot of very credible analysis that said that price for a barrel of oil could go much higher. That's in the United States. We are probably more resilient in this regard than many nations. But in places like sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps a little bit in South America, certainly in Europe, these economic reverberations would be very, very deep and long-standing. So that is it's not energy security in a traditional sense. It's where we have this nexus of energy security and environmental security, and we need to continue to be mindful of that and to do some things to substitute for oil where we can, and where it makes economic sense, and where it makes quality of life sense. So we need to get more biofuels. We need to get more electric vehicles. We need to get more natural gas-powered, hydrogen, et cetera. We need to be more efficient in our use of every gallon or barrel of oil. And every percent that we lower, we are that much more insulated from the reverberations of the global economy. If there's an Iranian scenario, if terrorists struck major oil transshipment points, if Hurricane Katrina's son or daughter wiped out the Gulf complex for refining or for oil exploration.
Absolutely, though, please.
Sure. Yeah. So to pick up on Admiral McGinn's assertion about the cost effectiveness of protecting the U.S. economy and U.S. interests around energy security, I think so. As an economist, the way I think of it is, let's list exactly what our exposures are. You know, is it the cost of protecting sea lanes? Is it the macroeconomic exposures from oil price shocks, that kind of thing? And if you just go through the list of risks and you weight them by the probabilities that they're going to happen, and then, so just think of it in terms of an insurance premium. What's the insurance premium we should be willing to pay to improve our energy security along these lines? And I'm going to just confine myself to oil for a second, because that's really where we're talking about macroeconomic exposures for the most part, at least in terms of the broad U.S. economy. So the best estimates of the energy security premium associated with oil, the estimates I've seen range up to about $6 a barrel for imported oil and a little bit less for domestic oil. So this is work by Steve Brown and Hill Huntington. And so, you know, you can go through their work and sort of see which risks that they've tried to monetize. It seems to me that should be kind of our price point. To the extent that you've monetized it as best you possibly can, that should be our price point for moving oil out of our economy. So to me that suggests, well, paying $26 a gallon for cellulosic biofuel is not cost effective from an oil security risk mitigation standpoint. Are there other policies that could be more cost effective that get you to the same security endpoint? That seems to me to be the relevant policy question there.
All right, David. So should we be even thinking about, should the goal be to get off oil?
No, I don't think we should have a goal to get off oil. I mean, I appreciate energy security, and I don't know about $6 a barrel, but let's look at what are the proposed solutions. If it's biofuels, you know, and the biofuels are substitutes. If we have biodiesel and regular diesel that can be swapped, the price of biodiesel will reflect the world price just as much as regular diesel. And the same thing for ethanol. They're going to be sold at a world price for the energy equivalent to the extent that they can be substituted. If you have only certain vehicles can use a certain fuel, then they will be isolated. All right? So you don't really get anywhere. It does help our balance of payments. It's better if we produce the oil that's $150 a barrel than if we have to import it. So it's better if we produce our own petroleum, and that's certainly one way to go. And it reduces our energy, the security cost. I don't know about the study that Adele was referring to, but the one that the EPA did, you looked at it and it was, you got as much benefit. They were trying to promote energy conservation in a rule that they were making. And they came up with a number, I think it was more like $12 a barrel. But it was lots of it on balance of payment. That's where they got it. And we get the benefit as much from producing another barrel as from cutting consumption by another barrel. And there's also this, what I consider a fantasy, that if we put a $15 per barrel tax on petroleum, that there's just going to be unleashed this amazing amount of creativity. We're going to be driving cars to get 100 miles per gallon or who knows what, or we won't have to drive cars, this and that, and the other thing will happen. Well, we can look. This experiment has been done in Europe, all right, where the price of petroleum is about $8 a gallon and has been for decades. It's been several times much higher than what we would get with Adele's tax. What sort of innovation has been created there? I was just there a couple of weeks ago. The innovation is they drive smaller cars, spending more money and not going quite as far. That's not the dream world for me. All right. Here's the deal. We're going to unleash this creativity, and the only thing they can think of is to come up with smaller cars and don't go so far. All right. The $15 a barrel is not going to be anything magical. It will create $100 billion a year more for the people on Capitol Hill to spend.
All right, Admiral McGinn, I think David makes an excellent point. Europe has been going down this road for a long, long time, and are they more, now from a broad sort of global perspective, are they more secure for having gone down that road?
Well, economically, I think they are, because for a couple of reasons. It has spawned some technology innovation, including in the European car market. I don't think David visited BMW or Mercedes or some of the other great car companies that we love in this country, and that are producing some very, very fuel efficient and pretty neat cars to drive. The other thing that's done, if you said, okay, if they hadn't done this, how much of their gross domestic product in the European Union, for example, would be going to pay the oil bill as opposed to what they have done? They're maintaining a quality of life. They are paying less to maintain that quality of life, of which transportation is a key component, and therefore they are more economically secure. And you could also say that if in an energy security standpoint, they are probably more secure for those reasons as well. Have they made some mistakes, and have they paid costs? Sure. They've been leaders in many, many areas, especially in the large-scale deployment of renewable electricity. Germany is a good example with their feed-in tariff mechanism to really expand that. But there are benefits that have accrued to market leaders, if you will, and some of those have been in the sales of technology that have been developed and scaled up in Europe. Others are the economic security, the local and regional air quality or water quality, land quality that comes from cleaner choices to produce electricity. You've got some nations like Denmark, tremendously aggressive and very, very diversified in their portfolio, taking advantage of what it is they have available. They've got the North Sea with North Sea wind. They've got tidal energy. They've got wind. They have solar. They have onshore wind. And so I take that lesson and apply it to the United States, and there is probably no nation on earth that is as blessed with energy resources, fossil fuel, as well as renewable energy of all sorts, from hydro to biomass to geothermal to wind, onshore, offshore, tidal, et cetera, than the United States. So I think that is a plum that is out there waiting for us to seize.
Can I just respond?
Certainly.
Yeah. No, I did not go visit the BMW or Mercedes manufacturers, nor have I visited a BMW or Mercedes dealership here in the U.S., because I can't afford that. I drove a Skoda with my knees hitting the steering wheel, and I still paid $100 to fill the thing up with 6 gallons or 8 gallons or whatever it was. Denmark, see, the point is we can have all these wonderful things at a cost. I lust for a Tesla S model. All right, I think that's the coolest looking car on the road right now. And I would like it just to commute back and forth. I certainly want to drive it to New Hampshire for my vacation, because I would use half my vacation getting there. But if we look at Denmark and all the amazing things they've done, that's a unique market. They can sell their excess wind when they're producing it to countries nearby. They get backed up by hydro in Norway, and they pay 30 cents per kilowatt hour instead of the 11 or 12 cents we pay here. I don't know what kind of economic security that is. All right. Yeah. All these things we're going to smooth this out, but it's all going to cost 3 times as much, so that we don't have to worry about the price going up. I don't want that.
Well, at least it wasn't a Vespa. It could have been worse, I suppose. Adele, please talk about Europe and your thoughts on their efforts to reduce carbon emissions and increasing energy security generally.
Well, I think I'd rather talk about the United States and what I think would work here. And I think our experience in energy our experience broadly with industrial policy is I would say a checkered past. And I think it's really, it's kind of an exercise in wishful thinking, I'm afraid, to say we're going to build the hydrogen economy and we're going to throw a lot of money at hydrogen and then we're going to have this new market, when you really haven't addressed the drivers of demand for the technology. I mean, you can push on supply, but what about demand? You're pushing on a string. And so, in general, I tend to view industrial policy as sort of fraught with hubris, prone to crony capitalism, prone to sort of bureaucratic capture of stakeholder interests, and generally not likely to be economically efficient ways to solve problems. And a lot of the claims around creating green jobs and stuff is just not supported by the peer-reviewed economic literature. It's just not. So what I would say is look at the problems you want to solve very specifically. Is it carbon emissions? Okay, tackle carbon emissions specifically. Don't kind of go at this really oblique kind of indirect approach of subsidizing this and that, but just go to the heart of the matter and internalize the external cost directly. If your concern is around the military obligations associated with oil consumption, well, think very carefully. What's the most cost-effective thing we can do to address that very specific issue? And when you do that, you don't, I don't think, end up with feed-in tariffs and stuff like that. I mean, you don't end up with a concern of we should have this much solar and this much wind and kind of this sort of centrally planned composition of particular generation technologies and so on. You end up with an outcome driven by markets that are guided by very carefully tailored government interventions that are specifically targeted to particular problematic outcomes. And so I think I tend to be kind of dubious about these sort of European-style market interventions. And a lot of those are predicated on a very high willingness to pay by European households that I just think is not applicable here at all.
Interesting. So earlier,
really quickly, I agree with everything she just said. I would get different answers when she says, you know, what do we want to do about carbon? But everything else I agree with.
Well, Admiral McGinn, earlier you said that public-private partnerships were potentially a way forward, at least to some degree. I think such partnerships have seen challenges in recent years. How can we do a better job? What do we need to do a better job with public-private partnerships?
I think as in most things, it's a matter of balance. There can be too much government intervention, public intervention. There can be too much private sector, shall we say, laissez-faire. And getting the balance right is really important. And it's unfortunate that in our current political malaise, we tend to run, or for the most part, run for the edges, where it's all about free market or it's all about government control. The truth, really, if you look back on our history, is some of our great successes have been, in fact, public-private partnerships. A couple of examples where with the most government aspect leading as an example, the Manhattan Project. That was not something that was brought to us by the private sector, but it was government organizing the best brain power in the country in a time of national distress to produce capability that ended World War II. Another example, more private sector involvement, was the Apollo program. That wasn't an idea that was conceived by the private sector. Gee, I think we see a good profit here going to the moon. But when you think about it, the private sector made a lot of money, and all of us benefited in some way through technology advancement and the economic engine of everything in the value chains that created the Apollo program. The interstate system, the private sector sure has gained a tremendous amount of utility, and we have all benefited by the infrastructure. I'm just using the example of interstate highways because we use them every day practically, but the whole infrastructure of airports or whatever, that is stuff that tends to be best catalyzed or led in some cases, at least in early stages, by the public side of it, but the private sector really gets going and brings the best technology, the best business practices, the greatest innovation. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as we think about how we are transitioning to a clean energy economy. Make no mistake, we will be a 100% clean energy economy someday. I'm not going to put a year on it, perhaps not even a century, but we will be there for all of the value proposition that clean energy has vis-a-vis the way we've done it for many, many years. And it's a tough road. The political divisiveness that we have is reflective in some measure because of vested interest. Utilities worried about stranded assets, for example, or tremendous infrastructures in the production of petroleum and all of its products. I mean, these are really good people, good companies, high standards that are producing a valuable product. And to think that they're going to let it easily slip through their fingers or their stockholders' fingers, that's not an easy thing to do. But nevertheless, just as we've seen in the history of this country, we will see the displacement of many forms of energy that we are currently using for all of the right reasons. And it will be partly because of public catalyst for reasons of public health or national security or something like that, and then the private sector response. I'll conclude this remark by simply saying that there's a pretty good congressional record of attempts by the government to move in a different direction than the status quo. You can go back in a congressional record and it's really amazing. Change the name of the company, change the name of the CEO who's testifying before the congressional committee, and the arguments are always, always the same. Whether it was seat belts or airbags or anti-lock brakes or catalytic converters or unleaded gasoline or DDT, asbestos, leaded paint. The argument is the American people want this. The American people can't afford the new thing. Give us 10 years and we will produce something even better than what this government policy is going to produce. And directly relevant to this conversation, when the Clean Air Act was first proposed and debated, and some of the dire predictions of the costs to the utilities and the ratepayers paying it that were going to ensue, and none of them turned out to be true. Was it more expensive initially? Yes. Did we get over it? But I think that my point is that we need to get good public and private sector coordination. It isn't all government all the time. It isn't all free market. It's getting the balance right.
All right. David, I'm going to let you respond to that. Okay. And Adele, I want you to respond also, and then I want to throw it open to the audience. Okay. So, David.
Real quick, I want to go back to the beginning. I didn't say that when you talked about the infrastructure after the hurricane, I agree. I think that is an area that people are concerned about, and there can be private responses as well as utility-level responses to that sort of security. That is when the wind comes through and knocks out all the lines. Okay. You mentioned the government programs like the Apollo program. Well, and there were spin-offs from that. And we get spin-offs from defense applications. But these were not programs. Nobody said, well, let's see if we can come up with a government program to make a more cost-effective product that everybody out there is already trying to make as cost-effective as they can. There wasn't anybody already flying to the moon, and NASA said, let's see if we can do it cheaper. All right, nobody was flying to the moon. There wasn't any private market for that. So there you have it. We do have.
We are now, however.
We are now
with SpaceX and orbital sciences.
Exactly. But my point is this: that if you set up a government program to try to outdo the private market for something they're already trying to do, you're almost guaranteed to lose. If you say we want to come up with cheaper energy than the private market is, they're already putting investments in that. The government programs that succeed are where the government programs are trying to create something, a military mission. There's no private market for tanks, I hope.
The NRA would argue with that.
Yeah, depends on the
There's no
area of the world,
intercontinental ballistic missiles and missile defense. These are all great government programs as far as
the only way means to pry it from my cold dead hand.
Well, okay, you'll be my
we
buddy
isolate that.
Okay. And then we need to get to the analogizing of CO2 and all lead in the paint and lead in the gasoline and so on. Let's remember CO2, and this is one that whenever you see a news program and they talk about CO2 emissions, they always invariably show either a smokestack spewing something, which is almost invariably steam, or two, a picture of a smoggy city. CO2 is odorless, it's non-toxic, and it's clear. It is not a poison. It will not be a poison at 700 parts per million or 1,000 parts per million, all right, or 2,000 parts per million. All right, so we don't need to talk about toxicity. We don't need to equate CO2 with any of these other criterion pollutants which have demonstrated health impacts.
A quick one.
Sure.
You can have too much of a good thing, colorless, odorless, non-toxic. So just imagine if we all had nice, go down to the dry cleaners and get some plastic bags. Let's put them over our heads, and let's take in 20% oxygen and breathe out a little bit of CO2. We're going to do it for a little while. Pretty soon it gets kind of toxic. The point being that you need to have a view that, and I think David said something along these lines earlier, that it isn't one side is always right or one side. I think I was talking to Alfonso actually earlier. One side is always right, one side is always wrong. You got to go full tilt one way or the other. That's not the case here. We need to have some balance.
All right, Adele.
CO2 will not be toxic under anybody's projection. We're not getting to that level. I just want to make that absolutely clear.
Well, let me just make it clear that nobody should put a plastic bag over their head either, right?
That's what the fine print says on the bag.
I see. Adele,
Sure.
Good thing to finish up with, I think, carbon.
Well, let me first correct something I just said. I made some slam against green jobs. My point is not that you can't create jobs in the sector you subsidize. Yes, you can do that. So anything you want to subsidize, you can create jobs in that sector. What I meant to say was, if your goal is to create jobs on net over the long run, the best thing you can do is undertake pro-growth, responsible macro and microeconomic policy. And that, to me, doesn't necessarily involve forays into industrial policy. But I also want to correct one other thing, is that just because you put a price on carbon doesn't mean there's no other market failures or no other role for government. There is a role for government in research, certainly. This is not an endeavor that necessarily is going to be provided at the optimal level by firms left to their own devices. So I think the research component to energy, to alternatives to fossil carbon sources and other technologies that we've been talking about here, certainly basic research is a very important role for government, and infrastructure as well. And the question is, what infrastructure do you build, and what kind of price signals does the infrastructure respond to? So it's really important to get prices right. And finally, I would just say a few words about the important role for benefit cost analysis. Admiral McGinn rightfully talks about getting the balance right. So how do you do that as a practical matter? Well, we have tools under Executive Order 12866 and its successors to balance benefits and costs of federal regulation. We have fiscal disciplines and processes for how we judge the merits of various federal spending. One can quibble with this, but the idea would be to try to undertake policies for which we think the benefits exceed the cost, and that would be my that would be my proposal for how to get that balance right.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I'm going to throw it open to the audience. Any questions out there?
Thank you. You were talking about just different ways of looking at externalities. And David, I want to go back to your comment because I want to get some more clarity on it. You were talking about that there's several ways to address externalities and that externalities are not always bad. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate.
By definition, they're bad.
Okay. Well, you were saying that they're not, that if you do too much, like you were talking about SOx and NOx, that sometimes you're internalizing too much and it changes the price.
Yeah.
If I got it correctly, maybe I didn't. But my question is what do you see as the externality right now within, if we're talking about energy, that you think is the number one externality that needs to be addressed, say, in petroleum to give us that real price? Or do you think it is priced?
Well, I don't know if you'd call it an externality. I would say it's the groups that are trying to block access to North American energy resources. All right. The question of I think Adele would say, well, we have regulations for all sorts of things, but not for CO2, and that's the unaddressed externality. If you focus, okay, let's say it's $5 per ton of CO2, which is what some estimates are, and you put a $15 per ton tax, you're actually making that market less efficient. And because it's such a narrow tax base, even if you use it to offset some other taxes, it's quite likely that a more efficient thing to raise money would simply be an income tax. So the externality, it has not been demonstrated to me, the economics, that even with the rising temperature that we're seeing, we haven't seen for 10 years, but it's likely to continue rising at the 1 degree per century rate that it's done for the past 100 years, the past 50 years, the past 25 years, but less than that for the past 10. If it resumes and goes at that rate, that's not a problem. I don't see that as generating some externalities. Second, if we're talking about an externality of 5 or 10 or 15, as a public choice economist, you have to say, okay, what happens when we give the government the tool that will address the problem that we want to address? Will they stop at 5 or 10 or 15? Will they use that money to offset the most inefficient tax? Will they transfer it to the people that are being hurt the most? Or have you been paying attention to what they did with Waxman-Markey, for crying out loud? All right? That was sausage making at its worst. And if you say, okay, we're going to run this carbon tax through that mechanism, you have to have an externality way in excess of $15 or $25 to make the government inefficiency worthwhile.
Adele?
Let's see. I would say that what we have now, when we're talking about whether we should reject what might be efficient infrastructure in the form of new oil transport pipelines, what it is it's a proxy fight over climate policy. And the reason people are focused on that infrastructure is because there's nothing else moving on climate, right? So one hope I would have, if we had responsible, cost-effective, efficient climate policy, where we've used that in the most pro-growth approach, that we don't have these other arguments, because we would be saying to the oil companies, look, we've got a price, you're going to face the full social costs of your product, you're going to face declining demand. It's your money, knock yourself out. If you want to build a pipeline, do it in, according to the rigors of local environmental protection. But, that's your investment dollars. And we're not going to tell you no, but you are going to face a price on carbon for your product that's appropriately set. So, that's sort of what I think is let the private sector deal with those risks and don't use that as a fight over climate policy. Now, David raises the point of what is the social cost of carbon? What do we think really is those external costs? And there's a huge range of estimates. I start at $16 a ton. There are estimates up to over $100 a ton, depending on complicated questions about how you discount future climatic damages to the present, what sorts of monetizing approaches you use to ecological damages and human health risks. That is a whole nother conversation. I think probably $16 is on the low end of those estimates. Certainly there are estimates as low as $5, but nobody who's looked at it says that the estimate is zero. And I would just say that we know there is an external cost. It's not zero. I can't tell you what the existence value of polar bears in the wild is. It's not infinite, but it's not zero. How do you do all that? I can't tell you, but I think we got to pick something and move on and just do the best we can. Bill, did you have a question?
I just had a question because the discussion about the effects of taxing different streams wasn't entirely satisfying to me. And David, I guess even if there were no climate problem, it would make sense, and it seems that most economists agree with this. It makes more sense to tax pollution than it does to tax jobs, to tax income, to tax savings, and that grandma has had her savings and her income taxed all this time. Why not tax pollution? It seems to be that the position that you're taking is saying you or Heritage Foundation supports taxing prosperity, and that doesn't seem to make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and I didn't say that. And I do not speak for the Heritage Foundation, by the way. No scholars from Heritage speak for the foundation. You undercut your argument. You say, suppose there's no climate problem. Then what's the problem with CO2? Why is it then a bad? It's only the pollution you talk about if you say it's this thing. Okay, then the question is, well, how bad is it?
Taxing an externality would seem to be more economically sensible than taxing a benefit.
Okay, does CO2 represent that externality?
Again, I'm not saying CO2. I'm saying pollution.
Okay,
so let's
I'm
take it
here
off
to
of
talk
CO2.
about carbon policy. I mean, maybe you can come up with something else, like people who don't take vitamin pills enough are going to be more likely to spread disease, and we should therefore tax them if they don't take that. But
No,
let me get back. The problem with taxing a narrow stream of income is that to raise the same amount of money, you have, I hate to get too wonky here, but I think Adele will agree with me, a bigger deadweight loss for each dollar that you raise. You want to have as broad a tax as possible if we're just talking about income streams, not about taxing negative externalities. Now, if we have a negative externality from CO2, but it's not very large, and you impose a tax that's multiples of what the negative externality is on the margin, then you can generate a deadweight loss that is still greater than if you tax the broad thing and simply ignore the externality. And I think we don't know what that is, and I think we're looking at taxing way above what the externality is.
But I think that what the direction that the argument takes always seems to wrap back to let's keep things the way they have been for the last 50, 100 years, and obviously, we're at a situation economically where we are non-sustainable. Environmentalists would say we are environmentally non-sustainable. We need to adjust in some ways. Doesn't it make more sense?
Here's what's been going on for the past 50 years. It's always the same argument. We have an existential threat. It's cooling. No, it's not cooling. No, it's population growth. No, it's not population growth. It's resource extinction. It's peak oil. All of it requires that we get to put our thumb on the jugular of the economy.
That's
okay.
I'm going to let it go.
I will say I'm going to interrupt here, and I'll just say that we need to, carbon may or may not be, depending on your perspective, warming the atmosphere, but it's time to cool things down here. So, Admiral McGinn, you wanted to say something?
Just a point. It really is about risk management. The risk, do we have 100% certainty? No. Do we have some certainty? You bet we do. So in 2007, Military Advisory Board at CNA had a chairman, Gordon Sullivan, former chief of staff of the Army, and he said, guys, we never have 100% certainty. If you wait for it on the battlefield, something bad's going to happen. So you need to look at the indicators and warnings, and you need to take prudent actions. And prudent in this case, in terms of thinking about global warming, is taking an insurance policy, to use Adele's approach, an insurance policy out that if I have a home, and if my insurance company said, hey, you get fire protection here. Do I have that because I think it's going to burn down? No, I don't think my house is going to burn down. But I sleep better at night knowing that I have that insurance just in case. Now, if my insurance agent came up and said, hey, got some bad news, Admiral, your policy's going up to $1,000 a month for your fire protection, I would find a way not to believe in fire. I guarantee that. So the debate is in some ways unspoken. We fear the negative consequences of the cure, if you will, for a disease that is less than absolutely certain. And I think that we need to take a risk management approach that prudently makes investments, if for no other reason, for adaptation, because let's assume, and I don't agree with this, but let's assume that climate warming, global warming, is on some cycle that has nothing to do with carbon emissions. But if it's warming and it's going to have some consequences to severe weather and sea level rise or whatever, it sure would make sense for us to spend some money on infrastructure, making it more resilient and adapting to it. Then we can have a discussion about, can we mitigate the worst effects if, in fact, there's this aggregating factor caused by greenhouse gases, including carbon, but not limited to carbon. Methane is another big one, 30 times stronger greenhouse gas than carbon.
Okay, well, and I'll go right to the audience in just a second, but on the issue of insurance, and Adele, I want you to speak to this. And there is a point at which it just doesn't make sense, even if the risk is, $1,000, to not pay it. Right. Can you discuss that?
Let me give you one other thing to insure against. So the Supreme Court has upheld the president's authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Okay, so that's about as certain as you can get in Washington. So that's your default. So what I would just say is there's an opportunity in broader fiscal reform to get market-oriented environmental policy and pro-growth tax reform. I think this should take serious consideration by everybody who's concerned about the fiscal future of the country, of the economic environment for enterprise and the environment. And even if you don't care about the environment, you got to be mindful of existing authorities and prospectively what they might mean for the issues you are concerned about.
My only concern, Adele, is if we let them start taxing carbon, the next thing you know, they're going to tax tobacco and whiskey.
David,
I think they already do, actually.
Yeah.
So.
Not the whiskey. Come on. Every one of these panels I'm on, somebody brings up insurance. Like, this is insurance. And it's a complete misunderstanding of the concept of insurance. All right? The insurance that Admiral McGinn is talking about is like saying, well, Aunt Judy might trip on the front steps of the porch, and therefore we need to make sure we have handrails and we have cushions out the bottom and somebody to catch her. And, we don't know. It might happen. Insurance is, these things are unknown. You want to have the economic wherewithal to make good on it if it does happen. Sure, where prudently you don't have the third step missing. All right. And so that's where we need a robust economy. Second, if we have this carbon policy, if we have Adele's carbon tax, now the part of her amazing dream that she didn't emphasize but that we need is that somehow we're going to talk all the other countries into this, that China's going to say, hey, you know what? We don't really want the sea level to rise 1.5 feet. We want it to rise 1.25 feet, and therefore we're going to cut our economic growth, and we're actually going to connect those windmills we've been fooling you about to the grid. We're going to stop producing 50 gigawatts of coal energy every year because our people are so poor. India, last summer, they had a blackout. Half of India was without electricity. The week before the blackout, a third of India was without electricity. How that's unconscionable to ask them to cut back on their energy so that we can moderate the sea level growth. And they've said absolutely crystal clear, both India and China, hey, we're not going to do this if it cuts into our economic growth. If you come up with some way where it doesn't, like you give us great big piles of money from your carbon tax, maybe we'll think about cutting it some. That's not going to happen. You're not going to get Congress to authorize money to go to India and China. All right? China's not going to cut back. Now, is it an existential threat? It's not the end of the world. What we want is insurance, and that is a robust economy and affordable energy.
All right,
I just want to mention briefly that I fundamentally disagree with David on one point he just made, and that is that to do something about global warming implies that our economy is going to be hurt. that is a fundamental disconnect. That the political argument goes that way, but we've got so many examples in the past where government regulation, mandates, that terrible word, mandates, have actually produced value for our economy and certainly improved our quality of life. And despite the doom and gloom predictions of the private sector.
All right.
Nick, it's perhaps can everybody hear me? It's perhaps the subject for another panel, but one of the problems I always have with these kinds of discussion of energy policy is not defining where we want U.S. energy policy to put the United States. I'm a business guy. I'm not trying to come out even here, guys. I'm trying to develop an approach to energy and carbon which makes the United States more secure and competitively advantaged. I'm not trying to save the world. I'm trying to create an environment where I can prosper as the United States, in an environment where I know other actors are going to take a very different approach to the same problems we're talking about today. Can we find a way to change this discussion, agree on what that energy vision for the U.S. should be? $8 gasoline is not my idea of success. Being energy secure, because all my oil is coming from North America, but still being subject to a pricing regimen that makes me pay prices as high as if I hadn't done all that stuff to get extra energy security, is not my idea of success. $26 a gallon ethanol is not my definition of success. If we don't kind of agree on what the final endpoints of the policy should be, I don't think we'll ever come up with a policy that makes any sense.
I think this is the appropriate place to discuss this. Who wants to?
I had some $26 ethanol just last night.
18 years old?
And just for the record, there is a reception at Union Station later, and we will be partaking of that.
Yeah, you know what they say in the ethanol business, drink the best and burn the rest. But ethanol, by the way, is far lower than $2 a gallon. But what you're talking about are some of the newer feedstock-produced biofuels that were mixed with petroleum. But your point is well taken.
I guess I would just like to say that only in D.C. do people, well, and I won't say that, well, most of the people say, we have to have an energy policy emanating from Washington. You know, we don't have to have an energy policy. We don't have a clothing policy. We don't have a shoe policy. You know, we managed to get all these things without policies. All right? I hope Exxon has a policy. I hope BP has an improved policy. You know, I hope these other people, I hope the BMW and Mercedes continue with trying to make more efficient cars because people like to save money. All right? There was a question in the previous panel that said, or there was an assertion made that new industries, all right, always have higher growth rates than the old ones. You're not going to get a high growth rate out of the fossil fuel industry. I would like to take some Solyndra employees and have them talk to some people in the Bakken in North Dakota. Which one had a faster growth rate? We've gotten phenomenal growth rate from this hydraulic fracturing. It's opened up reserves that we didn't even dream about 10 years ago. And that's old fossil fuel. That was not a big government program in spite of what some people will say. That was George Mitchell using the tools he could find and keep pushing, and people, more art than it is science, trying slick water this way, this mix, that mix, and all of a sudden they made it work. And there's been a phenomenal return on that investment in an old industry.
If you take a look at his tax returns from the days in which he and colleagues were working on hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, you'll find that there was a government subsidy for that exploration industry that was significant, measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. There was a public aspect to a private endeavor that made a lot of sense, and we're seeing the benefits of it now. But as far as comparing Bakken and Solyndra, apples and oranges. Solyndra is its own story, but it is used as a poster child for everything that is wrong about renewable energy, wrongly so.
Okay,
all right.
A123 batteries.
All right. I would make the point. Was that a subsidy or was it a tax break? And I think that's an important distinction.
I'm using the term subsidy in its general.
I see.
In a general way, it was a tax break.
All right, 2 more questions. I'm sorry.
So David actually started to go here. There hasn't been a coherent national carbon policy, but there are 30 some odd states with renewable portfolio standard requirements. There are probably more than 20 states that do have carbon regulatory schemes. And I guess, and actually I would guess that they're the more economically critical states. So the question that I would have, and I truly don't have a bias with respect to the answer, but is that an efficient way of doing commerce in a nation like ours, that we have this mishmash of different regulations and companies that do business across state lines and certainly internationally are having to be aware of what the carbon policy is in Massachusetts and in California and so on and so forth. And beyond that, the utility regulatory policy is so dramatically different in the 50 states. And between co-ops and investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities, that's a whole other playing field. So I guess I'm curious to your thoughts on that. It's not as if it's no policy versus a policy. It's this mishmash of what we have versus some kind of coherent national policy.
Yeah, can I jump in on that? I think that's a fabulous point, and I'm really glad you made it. And I also want to say that really, if we don't undertake some kind of coherent federal climate policy, we're going to get even more of that. And if we do Clean Air Act regulation, we're going to get even more of that, because what's going to happen is we're going to have 50 different state implementation plans. They're going to be subject to all sorts of litigation and uncertainty. And you're asking about what should the vision be? I think resolve as clearly and simply as you can some of that regulatory uncertainty, and that let you guys in the private sector say, okay, now I know what the rules are, I can move forward, right? It's that impediment to investment when you're subject to all these dogs and cats, and it's not just regulation, it's tax incentives and various other subsidies and incentives at the state and federal levels. So my hope is that, try to streamline that stuff and set a level playing field and let you guys do what you do best.
Mike,
forgive me, Bruce. I think we have one. You get the last one.
Sure.
All right. Go ahead.
Just to address that last point, Adele, but it's not a level playing field. New York City is different than Nebraska is, and it always will be. And what people think in Nebraska isn't necessarily what they think in New York City. They have different needs, they have different energy needs, and they have different ways of doing things. And while it may be more efficient to give a big federal policy that says everybody is going to do it this way, that's not what works for the American people. And that's not the way that we set up our government to begin with. Another thing, just to talk about, we were mentioning taxes. Let me give you a vignette from my perspective. In 2007, I bought a Toyota hybrid car, a Camry. Not because I hug trees or anything like that, because it was going to save me money. We saw the writing on the wall, gas prices were going up, we bought a hybrid. And as I mentioned earlier to some folks at the table, this year Virginia has decided to add a tax onto my hybrid car because they're not earning enough revenue from me because I'm not buying enough gasoline. And that's the type of thing that when you talk about adding taxes and big government, when you start adding, carbon taxes and things to businesses that are already trying to survive in the economy, this is what we live with. This is what we see down at the muddy boots level.
Anyone?
I would just say that I don't think California is going to tax your Camry.
Actually, they are changing now. They're about to.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons to buy fuel efficient automobiles or trucks or what have you. And one of them, of course, is to save money. Others to save the planet or whatever your particular views are on that. But I will be the first to agree that with Adele that there has to be some sort of a federal standard in areas where you need something that is fairly universal, has principles, if you will. The reason we don't have a renewable electricity standard nationally or clean energy standard is for exactly the reasons that were mentioned, that every state is a little bit different. Its price structure, regulatory structure for utilities, its assets for energy, whether it's coal or fossil or oil or renewables. So we need to, once again, that word balance, strike a balance between federal policy and in our great federal system with state policy.
Great. Bruce?
So Adele did not tell me to say this, but if any of you pick up the report at the back of the room, you so modestly didn't refer to her own article. But on page 63, there are incredible numbers on a carbon tax. And we heard earlier today that Gordon Lambert said that in Canada, in Alberta, they're already thriving on a $16 carbon tax. And what Adele shows, I mean, if you look at it empirically, a $199 billion deficit tax, right? You show 7% decrease in corporate taxes, no burden on the poor. What I take away every time I visit Washington, and I haven't been a lobbyist here for 28 years, is so much wheel spinning ideological that you can't even look at good numbers anymore. It is humbling every time I come down here to see how inefficient the system is, because the Defense Department's moving on this and rational people are moving on it. End of comment. Thank you for your
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
And with that, yes, everybody should pick up Adele's book and anything else that's been published by anyone at the dais here. Please join me in thanking our great panel. Thank you so much. I want to also thank the BCLC and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for sponsoring this event and partnering with the Future 500. Thank you very much.